everyone, my name is Dominic and today you're tuning in to the Comic Book Report, where we review comic books and graphic novels so you can get an idea of what to read. And today I've prepared another quick list video for all of you. We're going to be talking about the 5 best Dawn of X comic book series. These are all X-Men or X-related books happening after the events of House of X, Powers of 10 by Jonathan Hickman. That's the work that really established this Krakoa era for our merry band of mutants, and honestly, it spawned a lot of great series. I can't wait to talk about my choices today, but before we do, I do want to shout out our channel sponsor, OrganicPriceBooks.com. If you're interested in picking up your own comic book collected editions, I highly encourage you to check out their website. You can find a link in the video description, and if you find something you like, you can even use my discount code at checkout, TheComicBookReport, to save $2 off of your order. Please note if you use my affiliate link or code to make a purchase, I will earn a small commission, but it's a fantastic way to support this channel. Thank you so much for considering. Now let's get started with today's list. First on the list, I have to talk about Jonathan Hickman's run on X-Men proper. Yes, this is the titular run that spins directly out of the House of X Powers of 10 maxi series, and honestly, I still think that this is a fantastic run. Why did I immediately qualify it like that? Because I think that this whole run is really polarizing for a lot of people. I think House of X Powers of 10 is almost immediately recognizable as a modern day classic, especially in X-Men storytelling. Frankly, it's one of my all-time favorite X-Men stories, and no modern X-Men book I've read recently has come close for me. It not only reset the entire status quo and feel for X-Men, but it created just such a wonderful new start to spin out all of these incredible X books. And Jonathan Hickman taking the reins from that event and going straight into his own run on X-Men, well, my expectations were certainly very high. And truthfully, I will say that for X-Men, Jonathan Hickman never wrote anything as good in my mind as House of X Powers of 10. That being said, when I really settled into his X-Men run, well, it's not without its own merits. What we have here in this X-Men run is kind of a collection of smaller storylines, kind of weaving throughout his relatively short run. I do think that something to be noted about this omnibus edition I'm flipping through right now is the fact that we have a couple notable missing issues. That's because in the midst of his X-Men run, he actually had his first big crossover event called the X of Swords. I really wish that event, or at least the X-Men issues, were included in this omnibus to get a fuller picture of what Jonathan Hickman was trying to do. After this event as well, we have another thing he wrote called Inferno that really kicks things into high gear for this Krakoa era of mutants. That is also not collected in this collection, and I think that that is a bit of a shame. We also don't have the full Hellfire Gala story that was also around this time period. But what we do have is the initial setup of the X-Men team for this Krakoa era. I will say that the storylines are a bit disjointed. We basically have a couple issues that spend time on each individual little kind of story runner. We have a time with the Summers family on the moon. We have a group of old ladies that have these kind of supernatural plants that they're fighting for. We have a small tale about mutants in the vault, and so much more. Frankly, what we don't have is one cohesive narrative once we get to this X-Men run. I think that this could have almost been titled Tales from Krakoa, rather than an X-Men book proper. Because what we don't see a lot of here is an actual X-Men team fighting villains or fighting problems. We really just have these kind of splintered groups of X-Men handling problems around Krakoa for the most part. It's still a really fascinating read, but again, you have to know what you're getting into. We also get an advancement of kind of the geopolitics of the Krakoa nation state, and I think because of that, this feels like a good backbone that a lot of these other series can run off of, with this kind of being a foundational frame. I really like thinking of this as Tales from Krakoa, and I still think it's a worthwhile read, particularly in that early Dawn of X, post House of X Powers of 10 era. Next on the list, we're going to be talking about Gerry Duggan's Marauders. Now, this is a really fascinating title. This is one I almost immediately heard positive reviews for right as we spun out into this Dawn of X era. You might hear me talking about that if you're not aware of what that is. That was the kind of X books that came out directly after House of X Powers of 10, right up until the point of, I don't know, maybe around the X of Swords event. Anyway, that kind of era of these titles is considered the Dawn of X. It's when they first established that nation of Krakoa for the mutants, and we have some of those early stories. Marauders as a title, what it really does is it's kind of the X-Men Pirates, I would say. We follow as the lead character Kitty Pryde, who will be going as Kate Pryde for the duration of this run. One of the things that happens during this Krakoa era is they have these kind of portals or gateways that look kind of suspiciously like stargates. Basically, they can plant these plants that make these gateways that they can travel through like portals, and they can kind of go anywhere they plant the other gateway, and all the mutants can use this. Sometimes they're allowed visitors, but it's basically their main means of traveling off into the island. For whatever reason though, and we think it might be due to her phasing abilities, Kate Pryde is the only exception. She's the only mutant that can't seem to use these portals. When she walks into them, it's almost like she hits a brick wall. This definitely makes her feel alienated from the rest of Krakoa, and she's kind of at a loss of what to do. Not missing a beat, the powers that be kind of decide to give her a ship, and she's basically running missions and different things for Krakoa. She assembles her own ragtag team of sailors, and essentially she becomes this wave of the Marauders. So we have her kind of playing pirate captain. She works sort of directly for Emma Frost, and to a lesser extent Sebastian Shaw, and it's a really interesting setup that has some ties to kind of the Hellfire Club, for those that remember that whole grouping of characters. They're now the Hellfire Trading Company, I believe, and it's just an interesting way to do commerce in this Krakoa era. This is an extension of that, but there's definitely a lot of swashbuckling high sea adventures, a lot of also kind of international battles, and we do have her own kind of X-like team. So we have her at the helm, we have characters like Storm, Pyro, Bishop, Iceman, to name a few. There are a couple different sort of revolving roster characters as well, but that's basically the setup for this book. This is X-Men on the high seas. If you're a fan of Kitty Pryde, Storm, Emma Frost, this is definitely a book for you. It's a lot of fun. It definitely doesn't take itself overly seriously, and it's just a breath of fresh air coming into a new title that you don't need to know a ton about, other than possibly reading House of X Powers of 10 first. I do think Marauders is one of the better Dawn of X titles, and it's one that stayed with me as well. It just feels like a fun diversion from some of the other more serious action-oriented titles, and that's not to say it was without its own moments of those. But there is a lot of levity and fun throughout this run, and it's really hard to describe other than it's just a blast. Next on the list, we have Tini Howard's Excalibur run as part of the Dawn of X era of Marvel books. So what Marauders was for pirate fiction, I would say Excalibur is to a straight-up fantasy X-Men series. Definitely harkening back to the older Excalibur runs, we still have a Captain Britain of sorts, though this time it is Betsy Braddock who is leading this team. With her, we also have Apocalypse, Jubilee, Gambit and Rogue, and Richter, to name a few. This is a really interesting team as well. We have them going into the other world, we have them around Krakoa and beyond. This is definitely an interesting hodgepodge mix of a team, but it was fun to explore. Like I said, if you like the fantasy genre, this is probably your best gateway into the Dawn of X books. And what's interesting too, I think that this was considered a lesser title when these were first spinning out, and yet the first event, X of Swords, probably leans heaviest on this title to set up its crossover. Is it essential reading to enjoy that crossover? Perhaps not, but I do think it is one of the ones to read if you want to enjoy the full breadth of that event. For me personally, one of my biggest draws to this book was Rogue and Gambit. Those characters are some of my favorite mutants, and I was fascinated to see what this had to offer. I don't think that this was their strongest showing, but it was still fun to see them on the roster. I do also really enjoy Captain Britain and the original Excalibur run that I've read, so I was curious to see how they paid homage to that with this book, and there are definitely a lot of fun Easter eggs. The inclusion of a character like Apocalypse on this team definitely adds a layer that I didn't expect upon the outset of this book, and it was definitely a fascinating title throughout. I will say on this list, and no offense to Howard or the rest of the crew for this book, this is probably the weakest entry on this list for me, but I think the more time that's passed since I've read it, I really really see how distinct this Excalibur run truly was. It really has its own flavor and feel to it, and I don't think that any of the other books quite matched it. I really liked the kind of hodgepodge, eclectic nature of the team they assembled in this book, and it definitely had its memorable moments. I think the art was luscious and interesting, and having a fantasy kind of scope, we got to really see a much broader variety of scenes and settings, and I really enjoyed that. I think all of the otherworldly threats was also fun when the rest of the Krakoa books were a little bit more straight-laced and down-to-earth. This is definitely something, again, for fantasy fans or those that really maybe like some of the mutants present in this team. For those that just want to check out the Dawn of X era, there might be better entry points like X-Men, but this is still one that is fun just off the beaten path. It's quirky, it's interesting, and I think having Betsy Braddock as Captain America at the helm, well, it definitely leads to some unique storytelling, and I know I, for one, will not be forgetting my time with this book. Don't miss out on Excalibur. And hey, if you're still watching this video and you've yet to subscribe to the channel, I just want to invite you to do so. I'm always doing list videos like this, comic book hauls, comic book reviews, and more. Anyway, thank you for considering. Now on with the show. Next on our list, one of my personal favorites coming out of Dawn of X, we're going to be looking at Benjamin Percy's X-Force. This was a fantastic book, and I think in many ways my biggest surprise from this Dawn of X era. This is X-Force. This is the Black Ops, the special operations team within the X-Men universe. In this Krakoa era, they not only are in charge of kind of peacekeeping around Krakoa, but they take on the most intense international missions, and it's filled with an impressive roster of mutants. We have mutants like Wolverine, Jean Grey, Sage, Beast, and Quentin Quire, to name just a few. There are, of course, more members of this team, but that's really a good foundational couple that you can expect. We also have notable appearances from Domino in this book for fans of that mutant as well. I think for me, one of my favorite things about this X-Force run, especially in these early issues, is that the art choice is a lot different from some of the other fare we're getting during this Dawn of X era. Even with so many other artists, I feel like there's kind of a uniformity to the visual representation of a lot of these X-Men books in this era. A lot of them are maybe overly rounded, heavier outlined, and more cartoony animated illustration styles. Maybe not all, but there are many that feel kind of in that more like realm of artistic comic book storytelling, and I feel like the X-Force artist we have here is a lot grittier, a lot harsher lines, a little more realistic looking, and I think that that really lended a lot to the tone and overall atmosphere of the story it's trying to convey. Again, being the kind of the Black Ops intense mission group, this is a little bit darker, it's a little bit more gory, it's a little bit more violent, and it's really fascinating. Any book that has Wolverine going a little bit full on is definitely okay in my book. I know for me, this was a fun start to a Dawn of X book, seeing the kind of missions they would go on. Of a lot of these early Dawn of X titles, this one doesn't feel as connected to some of the things leading into the X of Swords event, so you don't really need to read this as a precursor to that, I would say, but it does fill out this world nicely. I also think that this is a really fun entry point for newer readers that want to just jump in. I think that this doesn't require a ton of previous knowledge to my memory, and it is just interesting to let it all unfold. The X-Force team is also one of the few bands of mutants during this Krakoan government that are allowed to use lethal force when necessary, and that's where some of that aforementioned violence will come into play. I think that Percy has a really unique voice for these X-Men characters. I know that he wrote this and the Wolverine run I'll be talking about in a moment, and I think that he lends so much to these titles that I think really helps shape a darker, character-driven, and really important facet of this whole Krakoa era of X-Men storytelling. If you're looking to break into the X-Men era here, I would really recommend X-Force being one of your first stops. I think it treats itself a little bit more adult, and I think that it has a lot more layers than some of these other books. It definitely doesn't have that levity or lighter-hearted feeling that even the Hickman X-Men era does, or even Marauders or Excalibur, but honestly, if you're looking for an action-packed series that is a little bit darker edged, I think X-Force might be the stop for you. And last but certainly not least on my list of the best Dawn of X era X books, I'm going to be talking about Wolverine. Now this one sets itself apart a little bit because unlike all the other books, this is not a team book. No, we follow one mutant character, the titular Wolverine, and he's the best he is at what he does. Really like this book. This was also by Benjamin Percy, as I mentioned earlier in this video. This and X-Force, though you don't need to read both to understand what's going on, there is a lot of fun continuity between the two series. I also really like that the voice we get for the character Wolverine is identical to the voice we get here, obviously coming from the same writer. Like X-Force, this is one of the more violent entries in this whole Dawn of X era. In fact, I would say it's maybe a little more intense than even what we get in X-Force. We have Wolverine doing his own brand of justice making and kind of intel. We have him going on his own set of missions and getting embroiled in a lot of just dangerous situations like he is wont to do. Though not as realistic as maybe some of the art depicted in the X-Force title, we do still have a lot of striking imagery and illustrations throughout this Wolverine run. This is a really fun starting point for this character in the Krakoa era. I do think that there's been historically better Wolverine runs in my mind, but there's a lot of great stories here. What we have in this oversized hardcover collection are a small selection of story arcs that begin this new volume of Wolverine. I think that where he is in this time in his life is that Krakoa is sort of a peaceful island and the mutants are finally ahead. They're finally not really the underdogs. They're a world superpower almost. They're having their own nation. They have their own kind of seat at the table. And Wolverine is almost, I don't want to say listless, but he's so wary of this kind of peace they seem to have. And already he's considering it home and he's very defensive of that. And as we have him striking out to try to keep it safe and to try to figure out what's going on in the kind of geopolitical landscape, we have him again just falling victim into so many situations that he maybe shouldn't be a part of. This volume even deals with vampires. I mean, come on, how cool is that? As you can see, the art is definitely lush in this collection, and frankly, I read this after reading the X-Force volume, and I was just really excited to see how this spun out, and he had his own run here. This is what really put Benjamin Percy on the map for me, this and the X-Force run. I had never really read a lot of his stuff prior to these series, and he's not only a great X-Men writer, he's honestly a fantastic comic book writer. I really like his approach to these characters, and I definitely will be seeking out future work from him. Really like this. I think that this was maybe the most isolated feeling of the Dawn of X books, especially on this list, but I still think it's worth noting that this is a really fun entry into this whole era of mutant X-Men stories. If you want to read a lot of Dawn of X, but you're maybe getting a little burnt out on the team books or things that are too Krakoa heavy, Wolverine might be the book for you. I know it was one of my favorites. Okay, and that's going to round out my list of the 5 best Dawn of X era X titles or X-Men books. I know there are so many other series that a lot of people have recommended very highly. I know one that comes to mind is Hellions. I still have not read all of that run. I know the New Mutants a lot of people seem to favor as well, but there's even more than just that. So let me know, did I miss your favorite titles from the Dawn of X or Reign of X? What do you think of this Krakoa era of X-Men? Are you ready to move on, or do you really like it as I do? I'd love to hear from all of you. I've become such a bigger X-Men fan since all this stuff happened, and I really find myself fascinated by so many of the titles and events we've had in recent years. But again, I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear some of your favorite books, and honestly, thank you so much for watching. It means the world to me. I'm still having a blast with all these lists. Thank you so much again, and until next time, this has been the Comic Book Report. Please don't forget to give this video a like, a comment, and maybe share it with a friend. Thank you so much, and have a good one.